If you have been coming here to this service for a little while, then I think you're going to start picking up on something, growing more and more comfortable with something that maybe felt a little uncomfortable to begin with. And if you're here visiting, or if you're still new to this family of faith, this something that you're starting to pick up on might be just a little disconcerting. And the something that you may be picking up on is this. The Bible is weird. It's true. Some of the stories in this Bible are weird. We're today gathering to celebrate a story of a man that died and was dead for 3 days and then was raised from the dead. Some of the elements in different stories are weird, and there are elements in this story that are strange and peculiar. But even the way the Bible came to be what it is today is a little bit weird. It's followed a long and complicated process to take on the form that we have it today. And rather than avoid the hard conversations and the hard questions that are asked about this text, our hope in this community is this. We want to embrace the oddity. We want to have the hard conversations. We want to ask the difficult questions. We want to dig into the peculiar bits of this sacred text, because while this text is inspired by the divine, it's also been written and compiled and redacted and translated and translated and translated and translated again by a bunch of oddballs like you and me. And if a bunch of inspired oddballs encountered the divine while wrestling with this text, then that's the experience that we want to have as well. So here's one of the oddities about the end of the Gospel of Mark. There are 3 different endings. It's almost like a choose your own adventure. If you brought your Bible today, which I know we don't really do that too often anymore, if you opened up your Bible app of choice and you came to the 16th chapter of the Gospel of Mark, you will find some strange notes and brackets about the end of this gospel. Depending on the translation that you choose to use, you may have a different number of verses at the end of this gospel. And those verses will say different things. There was one ending to this book, and then somebody was a little uncomfortable with that ending, so they added a little bit more. And then someone else thought that that ending needed a little bit more, so they added to that. So this book has had 3 different endings, all coming within the first few centuries of the Christian faith. And the scholarly consensus is that the Gospel of Mark, as it originally ended after verse 8, ended after the verses that we read today. Some of those other endings go up to verse 20, but it appears that those endings were added later. If this makes you feel a little bit of tension, if this makes you go, it'll be all right. We can take a deep breath and we can learn from it. In order to produce what we know as the New Testament, we've had to consult more than 5,000 ancient manuscripts. 5,000 of them, and none of them are the original writings. That means that really, really smart people over the centuries who are intimately aware of the ancient languages have studied these thousands of documents to find out which words within them that we translate into the English are the most reliable. And they found that the stuff after verse 8 isn't quite as reliable as the first part. If you want details on this, I am a nerd. Invite me to coffee, invite me for a meal, we can talk about it. But you know, I can really understand why they'd want to add to the original ending. Because if verse 8 is the end of this gospel, it's a really strange ending. It's weird. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, Jesus over and over tells his disciples, tells the crowds that when he performs a miracle, don't tell anyone else. It's a strange feature of the Gospel of Mark. He always says, don't go and tell anyone about what I have done until the time comes. And do the disciples, the crowds ever listen? No. They always go and tell what happened. But in our story this morning, it says that they're told to go and tell that this Christ has risen, but these disciples flee from the tomb with terror and amazement. They say nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. Terror and amazement and fear and silence. Thematically, this ending counters everything that had come before in the gospel. And not only that, but if this is the end of the gospel, then it leaves us feeling rather uneasy. It leaves us feeling like the story is unfinished. They're told Christ is risen. They're told to go and tell. They run away in fear. The end. What happened next, we wonder? Why do we end on this note of terror? Why do we end with this story seemingly unfinished? I happen to think that that's part of the brilliance of this gospel. Earlier this year, we spent several weeks exploring stories of encounters with God. And at the end of that experience, as we went through those weeks, we noted something about each of those stories. Each of those stories about people that encountered God, we realized had a moment of absolute terror seize them. They meet God and they're afraid. A few of you even shared with me that this terror on the part of the people that meet God left you a little bit uncomfortable. New Testament scholar Gail O'Day makes a comment on our passage this morning that can be applied to all of these stories. O'Day says that terror and amazement are words that describe one's response to a theophany, to a revelation of God. It is God who has raised Jesus. It is God who has altered the rules of their known world. God has altered the rules of their known world. Fear in the face of the divine is normal. To meet God is to have every single one of our assumptions and expectations questioned and upended and challenged, and that is frightening. And for these women on this morning, their expectations and assumptions revolved around a grave. They expected to find occupied by a body of their would-be Messiah. I wonder exactly how they felt that morning. We know, of course, that they felt the grief as they made their way with oil and spice to this mundane task that was likely rather foul. They were certainly grieving their friend and their rabbi, but I wonder what else they may have been feeling. Throughout this gospel, anticipation has been building. Mark's language is always the next thing, and next, and next, and next, and then. Anticipation builds, and this band of pilgrims move closer and closer to Jerusalem, and the hope for something new is raising and raising. What would this Jesus accomplish? What would this Messiah do to set them free? And then death crushed all of that hope. Anticipation became desolation. Death crushed the hope of all of those who had shouted for salvation. Death crushed the hope of all of those disciples, each of them, who thought that they were working towards something more than a smelly tomb at the end of a week that was supposed to celebrate liberation. Death had crushed it all. And now these disciples simply have to go to the tomb and do what needed to be done. But I wonder if there was something a little more than the grief. I wonder if these disciples in any way felt a little bit of relief. Grief obviously always comes with death. But something that you learn as you encounter death more and more frequently is that it is also often accompanied with relief. Relief is a natural response to death. The painful road of decline has finally come to an end. The deceased has now found peace, only offered on the other side of life, and those that remain no longer bear the burden of caretaking, of listening, of following. And so maybe these disciples, the ones who remain in this story, they're devastated by what happened. Maybe they also find some kind of relief in this death. Maybe they're slowly realizing that the dangerous and risky future of following a rebellious rabbi as he confronts every system of authority that he can is no more. Maybe they're realizing that the path that they now walk is going to be a little bit easier. Sad, devastating, but certainly safer. And then come the words of the young man robed in white that the women find in the tomb. Don't be alarmed. You are looking for Yeshua of Nazareth, the one who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. And so not only do these disciples encounter the God that can alter the rules of their known world, raising the one who was crucified to life, but that slow realization of a safer future that they were imagining evaporates in an instant. The hard road forward suddenly looms on the horizon once again. And what they know is something that many of us in this very room have learned. After getting off the path, after our faith is rocked by desolation, by despair, by circumstances, by thoughts, getting back onto the path of following a crucified Messiah can be one of the biggest challenges that we'll ever face. Because for the most part, we settle back into the mundane pretty easily. We're ready to do what must be done, even if it stinks, even if it smells terrible, even if it's something that we never thought we'd be doing, because it's a little bit safer. It's a little bit more secure, and the anxiety of uncertainty has dissipated. And we think we're better off for it. We can find other ways to make peace, right? Ways that are a little bit less risky. We can find other ways to offer love and mercy and grace, maybe to some neighbors that are not quite as threatening. We can find other ways to advocate for justice in which the eyes of the critics and the law maybe doesn't find us. But the one who made peace, the one that created shalom, and the one who offers love and mercy and grace even to the ones that killed him, and the one that advocated for justice even at the cost of his life, has risen. Dr. O'Day finishes her thoughts on the fear and the silence in this passage with these words: in the face of theophany, in the face of meeting God, silence is not a failed or inadequate response. Silence is a wholly appropriate response. Because the women's silence creates a space for the voice and the presence of God to resound. The silence creates a space. And so maybe the realization that the crucified one is beckoning you back onto the path is hitting this morning. Maybe the risen one is calling you to follow the path with a little bit more intent. If you're hearing the call, if you are feeling the pull to pursue, that would make a lot of sense. Because here's another little oddity about this passage. The final word of the Gospel of Mark, at the end of verse 8, the final word is the Greek word gar. It's a fun one too, isn't it? Gar. It's a strange word to end a sentence with. In fact, there's no other instances of this word gar ending a sentence in any of the Greek translations of the Hebrew scriptures or any New Testament document of all 5,000 of them. Gar is not a word that ends a sentence except here. Because gar is a conjunction. Gar means and so. Gar means next. Gar means and then. The Gospel of Mark ends with an unfinished sentence. They went out. They fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And then way back in December, back in Advent, we started a liturgical journey through the Gospel of Mark that we've kind of moved in and out of. And on that day, we read the first words of this book, of this gospel. The first words of this gospel were this: the beginning of the good news of Jesus the Christ, Son of God. The beginning of the gospel of Yeshua the Messiah. Like this final sentence, this too is not a complete sentence. The beginning of the gospel. It's a title. It's the beginning of the good news. It wasn't an opening statement to begin the story. It's the title of the whole book. This whole book, this whole Gospel of Mark is just the beginning of the good news. That means that the story continues even after the book finishes. And just to make sure that you know that, Mark leaves the story open-ended. It ends with the original cliffhanger. And then we're absolutely supposed to wonder what happens next. We're absolutely supposed to realize that the next chapter, the chapter that Mark didn't write, begins with the disciples, especially with these women who witnessed something that brought them to fear and to silence, because at some point we know they had to tell that story. They had to have said something. Otherwise, we wouldn't be sitting here 2,000 years later wondering what happened next for them and what happens next for us. What comes next is this. The young man tells the women to return to the beginning, to go back to Galilee, to speak the good news, to witness to the Christ who was crucified and raised. And there and then is the same as ours. The and then is there to invite the disciples of every age, to invite you to write the next chapter in the good news. And then David bore the love of God in the world. And then Robert used his wisdom to supervise the church. The Gallaghers invited somebody unknown for a meal. The Browns found peace in the world and spread it. So much joy was shared by the children. Michaela and Molly and Sophia shared wisdom and wonder with the world. And then every single one of you gets to write the next chapter. And then you witnessed the risen Christ. There's one more oddity for you. Mark is the only gospel that ends without an actual sighting or encounter with the risen Christ. But even though that's the case, this doesn't mean that the Christ was not witnessed. There's a promise made by this messenger of God. The messenger says, go back to the beginning, tell the others, he is going ahead of you, and there you will see him just as he told you. The risen Christ went before them. Friends, the risen Christ goes before you. Wherever you go, Christ is ahead of you, preparing the way, preparing the world for its encounter with you. And it's only in moving forward that you will find this Christ. Go forward and there you will see him. In a moment, I'm going to give you just a moment of silence. And in that silence, I invite you to let the voice and the presence of God resound. And if fear comes, let it come. And if wonder comes, if a new call comes, if a new sense of purpose comes, let it come. And after this moment of silence, if you need prayer, I'm going to invite those that serve as prayer ministers here to come over onto this side of the room, and they would be happy to pray for you. To pray for you as you discern what it is that comes next. What is your and then? But for now, for a moment, breathe deep. And embrace the quiet. And embrace the voice, and embrace the presence of God. In the name of the God that upends our understanding, in the name of the risen Christ, and in the name of the Spirit that inspires and empowers us. And then.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.